On October 1st, 2022, a letter was published on the portal medium.com. Signed by Martin Luiga, Tallinn Inpatient Treatment Center of Psychiatry Clinic, Ward 9. In this letter, Martin wrote that he was dissolving the Zaum Cultural Association because it no longer represented the ethos it was founded on. Zaum, that's the name of the studio that created the game Disco Elysium, which became an incredible phenomenon. Created by a small team, it won numerous awards, has been called one of the greatest video games ever made, and still holds the highest PC game rating on Metacritic, beating even Half-Life 2, GTA 5 and Baldur's Gate 3. But it's not just about the awards. It's about the feeling the game leaves behind. If you ever played Disco Elysium, you probably recognized its soundtrack from the very first notes. You were drawn into the game's incredible atmosphere, picturing the streets of Martinez, the port, the dockwalkers' strike, the old church, and the hostel whirling in rags, where our character wakes up. In this episode we will talk about how this game was made, and more importantly, what happened to the studio after its release. And it turns out that story might be just as strange and tangled as the game's plot itself. Hi there and welcome to the Released podcast. Today technology surrounds us everywhere and we can't even imagine our lives without it. But every technology started as a bold idea in someone's head. In this podcast, we talk about the technologies that have changed our lives and the people who invented them. My name is Rival. Hi. The game takes place in a fictional world, in a city called Revashol, in the rundown neighborhood of Martinez. Our character wakes up in a trashed hotel room with a crushing hangover and absolutely no memory, not even of his own name. The windows are shattered, the bed is overturned, the tape recorder is broken, and empty bottles are scattered everywhere. Eventually we learn that he is Lieutenant Harry Dubois, a detective with the local police. He came to Martinez to investigate a mysterious murder. But I'll stop there with the story, because like any good detective tale, this is a game you will want to explore for yourself. So now let's talk about how the development of the game began. The future co-founder of the studio that created Disco Elysium, Robert Kurwitz, was born in Tallinn, into a family of artists. He dropped out of school at 15 and devoted himself to creative work. At the time, he was part of a group of 9 friends who had also dropped out of school. They called themselves the Overcoats. They even became something of a small phenomenon in Estonia, enough that other young people started wanting to join their group. This band of friends would later grow into something much bigger. In the meantime, they would meet up to play tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons. Yes, D&D shows up often in our season. It inspired many people to create their own games. During these sessions, they invented a fictional world that would eventually become the setting of Disco Elysium. Imagine how amazing that must be. As a teenager, having a whole world you and your friends created. A place you could escape to, far away from the rules of the adults around you. It all began with a love for Tolkien. First the books, then the movies, both left such a deep impression on them that they decided to create a world of their own. Here is how Robert himself remembers it.
Ma olin vahepeal nagu siin kõrval Tallinna Inglise Kolledž.
In the meantime, I had, like here early mentioned, Tallinn English College. I dropped out in the 9th grade. Because I liked more, there used to be this kiosk called Söögipläts. And I like hanging out behind the building, smoking and drinking Sarvik instead of going to class. And that wasn't really liked by the people at school. And somehow later, I couldn't handle 10th and 9th grade. It became too hard for me. You are like heroes if you can manage to do it all. I couldn't. And then I got very upset because I had nowhere to live and no money. And then my friends and I became Marxists. And then we got the idea that we could create a Marxist version of The Lord of the Rings. What if Karl Marx had written The Lord of the Rings? And it turned out to be a very creatively interesting idea. At 17, Robert became the lyricist and lead singer of the rock band Ultra Melancholy. As Robert says, at the time he was mostly just playing in a rock band and running tabletop role-playing games. It was probably a very creative and fun period, though it also meant they had almost no money. In 2008, Robert began writing his novel, Sacred and Terrible Air. He recalls that he had fallen in love with a girl and, wanting to impress her, decided to start a book. In 2009, he and his friends founded the Zaum Cultural Association, a sort of continuation of their high school group, the Overcoats. Yes, this is the same cultural association mentioned in the letter at the start of this episode. Among the founders were Robert Kurwitz, Martin Luiga, Yuri Sachs, and Argo Tulik. It all started as a blog where anyone could post their creative work. Anything from photos to short stories. Over time, it grew into a collective of artists and writers who made music, painted, published books, and of course continued to play tabletop role-playing games together. Soon, new people began joining the group. One of them was artist Alexander Rostov, who had heard about the unusual role-playing game they were running. Here is how he remembers it. Weird, obsessive D&D thing that wasn't about dwarves and elves, but motor carriages and people wearing top hats. It was like steampunk, but not vanilla steampunk. It was inspired by the French Revolution. When I got the materials, the photos of the characters and the maps in person, it was like, oh shit, this is the stuff. In the future, Alexander would become the lead artist of Disco Elysium. Another key figure for the future of the project was Estonian writer Kaur Kender. He had published his first novel back in 1998, and as Robert puts it, Kaur had a rare superpower. He understood money. In 2013, with Kaur's help, Robert decided to publish Sacred and Terrible Air, a novel set in the same Elysium world where the tabletop RPG took place. It had taken Robert 5 years to write. Unfortunately, the novel was a commercial failure. Only about 1,000 copies were sold, despite positive reviews from critics. For Robert, of course, this was devastating. Imagine working on something for 5 years only to realize almost no one wants it. He fell into a deep depression that lasted 3 years and began struggling with alcohol. Kaur wanted to help. Robert had helped him overcome his own alcoholism 3 years earlier, and now it was Kaur's turn to return the favor. He needed an idea that could reignite Robert's creativity. The inspiration, Kaur says, came from his children. They suggested Robert stop writing books. No one reads them anymore, and instead turn the Elysium world into a video game. Now think about this. You've just had a major project fail, and someone is asking you to jump into another one, in an industry where you have zero experience. Would you say yes? Robert hesitated. He decided to ask Alexander's opinion. I was thinking that we had failed in enough things, and I was just going to keep drinking, Robert recalls. But Alexander liked the idea, and his enthusiasm was contagious. He convinced Robert to write a one-page synopsis for the game. It went something like this. A D&D meets 70s cop show in an original fantastic realist setting with swords, guns and motorcars. Realized as an isometric CRPG, a modern advancement on the legendary Planescape Torment and Baldur's Gate, massive reactive story, exploring a vast, poverty-stricken ghetto, deep strategic combat. This vision felt so clear to them that they decided to begin development. But as you can imagine, making a game is never easy. For one thing, they didn't have enough money. They had no experience in game development, and in Estonia there were very few people with the skills they needed, which made hiring difficult. On top of that, they had chosen to make an RPG, one of the most complex genres out there. If you remember from our episode about Larian, creating a good RPG means writing an enormous amount of dialogue with branching outcomes and player choices, accounting for and testing all possible combinations, and making sure every thread connects. The final version of Disco Elysium had about 1 million words. To give you some perspective, the Lord of the Rings trilogy contains around 570,000 words, so we are talking almost twice that length. Money at first was solved thanks to one bold move. Kaur sold his Ferrari. As they recall, he bought it because he imagined driving it to Cannes, but they never gave him a price, so he sold it. They also raised funds from various investors and friends who believed in the project. Robert gave up smoking and drinking for the sake of the game, went on a diet and started exercising regularly. And so the Zaum Game Studio was founded, named after their original cultural association. The first office was in a squat, inside a former gallery, chosen mainly because it was cheap. The first job interview we did was in the attic, literally beside a pile of pigeon shit, Alexander remembers. In those first months, the team searched for the game's visual style. Robert even worked out of Alexander's house, so they could exchange ideas constantly. Alexander would create a piece of art that inspired Robert's writing, and Robert's stories would in turn inspire Alexander's drawings. Their influences included video games like Planescape Torment and Baldur's Gate, the TV series The Wire, and the works of authors like Émile Zola. In 2016, the studio secured its first round of venture capital. Some of that money went toward creating a beautiful soundtrack by the British band Sea Power. During a meeting in Birmingham, Robert realized it would be useful to open a UK office. It would make hiring developers easier, help with marketing, and give them better access to sales channels. They also looked at other studios that had moved to the UK and seen success. Eventually, part of the team, including Robert and Kaur, relocated there. The game was first announced in 2016. under the title No Truce with the Furious, with an expected release at the end of that year. But the launch was delayed to late 2017, then the game was renamed Disco Elysium and finally released in October 2019. By the end of development, the team had grown to 35 in-house developers and 20 freelance consultants from Estonia, the UK, China, Romania and Poland. 8 other writers worked alongside Robert on the game's text. And as I mentioned at the start, the game was an enormous success, winning multiple awards and glowing reviews. In 2021, the studio released Disco Elysium: The Final Cut, which added full voice acting for every character, several quests that had been cut from the original, updated graphics and animations, and 2 additional tracks by British Sea Power. Naturally, there were immediate plans for a sequel, for publishing Robert's novel in English, and even for a TV series based on the game. It sounded like yet another one of those success stories we've seen this season. Robert and his friends had spent 15 years building the world of Elysium, giving up everything, enduring poverty, and recovering from failure. Sometimes, reading Robert's notes, it feels as if this was the only idea they ever lived for, to fully realize the world of Elysium. And now, finally, they had recognition, resources, and big plans ready to be set in motion. But those plans were never meant to happen. In 2022, Robert Kurwitz, Alexander Rostov, and lead screenwriter Helen Hinpea left the studio, unwillingly. Soon after, Kaur Kender was also dismissed. How did this happen? And who could even have the power to remove the founders of the studio and the main creators of the game? Honestly, it's a pretty tangled story. And that is exactly what we're going to dig into in this episode. Think of everything up to this point as just the introduction. Now the most interesting part begins. A quick disclaimer before we go further. From here on, I will be giving you quotes and pointing to the sources they come from, so you can check them yourself. I'll do my best to tell the story without bias, no judgment, no taking sides, so you can decide for yourself who you believe. Disclaimer number 2. There is a lot of materials on this controversy. You can't fit it all into a single podcast episode, so naturally, I'll have to leave some things out. But I will cover all the key events, turning points, and claims. If you think I've skipped over something important, feel free to let me know. And if you really want the full picture and to understand all sides, I recommend reading the original materials yourself. Now let's imagine ourselves as detectives. And like any self-respecting detective, we need a big board on the wall, where we will pin up all our facts. First, let's put up photos of 3 people: Robert Kurwitz, Alexander Rostov, and Helen Hinpea, some of the main creators of Disco Elysium. Of course, many more people worked on the game, but for now, we are focusing on these 3. And one more photo goes on the board: Kaur Kender, one of the company's earliest investors. Now let's break this down. The game was released on October 15, 2019. Work began on a direct sequel, codenamed Y12, with Robert, Alexander and Helen leading development. At the same time, another project, a sci-fi game codenamed P1, was started with Carl Kender in charge. On October 1st, 2022, a letter from Martin Luiga was published on Medium. Yes, the same letter we mentioned at the start of the episode. If you recall, Martin was one of the founders of the Zaum Cultural Association. In this letter, he announced that he was dissolving the association because it no longer represented the ideals it was founded on. He also wrote, "Neither Kurvitz, Hinpe nor Rostov are working in the eponymous company Zaum since the end of the last year, and their leaving the company was involuntary." On October 2nd, Alexander confirmed on Twitter that they were no longer at the studio. So, the three key creative figures had left, for reasons that were still unknown to the public. On October 3rd, the studio released a statement saying that Disco Elysium was a collective effort, that every team member's contribution was important, and that they were continuing work on their next project. The news alarmed both fans and the press. Rumors began to spread about what might have happened inside the studio. Then, on November 9th, about a month later, a Medium post appeared from Alexander Rostov, written together with Robert Kurvitz. In it, they explained their side of the story. They said they were minority shareholders in the Estonian company Zaum Studio Oy. The majority of shares had been held by Estonian businessman Margus Linnamäe. In 2021, Margus decided to sell his stake to another minority shareholder, the Estonian company Tutreki Oy. According to Robert and Alexander, Tutreki was backed by two businessmen, Ilmar Kompus and Tonis Havel. They claimed that the money used to buy this controlling stake was taken illegally from Zaum Studio itself. Here is a direct quote from their post. "We believe that these actions, which in our view and the view of our lawyers amount to criminal wrongdoing punishable by up to 3 years imprisoned, were perpetrated by Ilmar Kompus, Tonis Havel, with support from Kaur Kender, another minority shareholder." This article ended with Robert and Alexander saying they were preparing to file lawsuits in court. Let's go back to our detective board for a moment. Remember, the first investor in the company was Kaur Kender. The main investor became Margus Linnamäe. Alexander and Robert were minority shareholders. And, according to this article, two other minority shareholders were businessmen Ilmar Kompus and Tonis Havel. Let's add 2 more photos to our imaginary board. In 2021, Margus decided to sell his stake to Ilmar and Tonis, which gave them a controlling share of the company. According to Robert and Alexander, the money for that purchase didn't come through legal means. On November 22, PC Gamer published an article describing the alleged scheme. According to Robert and Alexander, Ilmar Kompus bought 4 concept sketches, just drawing of a man in a scarf, meant for a future sequel, for just over €1. He then immediately resold those sketches to Zaum for €4.8 million through a shell company. Yes, 4 sketches for €4.8 million. They must have been some very impressive sketches. According to them, this money was then used to buy Margus shares, giving Ilmar Kompus control of Zaum. In other words, one shareholder allegedly used the company's own money to gain a controlling stake in that same company. Robert and Alexander say they knew nothing about this sale at the time. They became suspicious when they were demoted and after checking the Estonian company registry, realized Ilmar Campus now controlled Zaum. They believe Ilmar planned to sell the studio and Disco Elysium to big players such as Microsoft or Tencent. When Robert and Alexander started asking questions, they were fired. Meanwhile, Kaur Kender also sued the studio management. He claimed that when he began asking similar questions, he was first sent on vacation and then dismissed. But by December 2022, Kaur dropped his lawsuit because Ilmar Campus returned the 4.8 million euros to Zaum. Alright, this is getting complicated, so let's go back to our board and connect the strings. Here is the picture so far, based on these articles. The main creative team behind Disco Elysium, Robert Kurwitz, Alexander Rostov and Helen Hindpair, were fired from Zaum. Shortly after, Kaur Kender was also fired. They claim the company's management gained control through a fraudulent scheme, selling assets to the company itself and using the proceeds to buy a controlling stake. They say they were fired for opposing this. Robert and Alexander also allege that Kaur had initially helped management. From their perspective, it looks like the business side, through opaque dealings, took away the company and the rights to the Elysium world from the people who had spent 15 years creating it. Naturally, fans were outraged, with some calling for a boycott of future Zaum games. There were even reports of death threats against specific people and their families. But what does the other side, the studio's management, including Ilmar Campus, have to say? On November 9, 2022, the game industry portal published an article in which the studio stated that former employees of the studio, names are not mentioned in the article, were fired for limited to no engagement in their responsibilities and work, including not working at all for almost 2 years while still being paid by the studio, creating a toxic work environment, misconduct in interacting with colleagues, including verbal abuse and gender discrimination, attempts to illegally sell Zaum's intellectual property to other gaming companies in order to undermine the rest of the team. On the last point, Ilmar claimed Robert and Alexander had secretly tried to sell the game to other studios, but no one was interested. In the end, he said, their dismissal was demanded and carried out by executive producer Kaur Kender. And finally, the statement read, Zaum denies any claim of financial malfeasance or fraud that is being held against us. So, one side accused the other of fraudulently taking control of the company and its intellectual property. The other side said certain employees were fired for failing to do their jobs for nearly 2 years, creating a toxic environment and attempting to sell company assets without permission. In addition to all this, the YouTube channel People Make Games released a 2.5-hour investigation in May 2023, in which the creators tried to get to the bottom of the situation. If you want to explore the story in more depth, I highly recommend watching it. It is very well made. I don't personally agree with everything in it, but I can't deny that they did an enormous and important job. Thanks to their work, a lot more information about this case became public. In my episode, I'm leaving out some details and names, otherwise it would turn into a marathon-length show. But you will find all of that in the video. Most importantly, the investigation includes interviews with several people directly involved in the events, I'll summarize some of them here. The first interview is with Ilmar Kompus, one of the investors who ended up with a controlling stake in the studio. He is the one, along with his partner, whom Robert and Alexander accuse of dishonest schemes. In his interview, Ilmar says that all stakeholders were aware, or at least he thought they were aware, of these transactions, and that there was an agreement between all parties. In other words, Robert and Alexander supposedly knew about everything in advance and agreed to it. However, there is no written proof of this. Ilmar also says that all of these actions, acquiring stakes, creating new companies, transferring certain IP, were meant to benefit everyone involved. For example, Robert and Alexander owned 10% of the company that produced the first game. But in the new company set up for the sequel, their shares doubled to 20%. Since the next game was expected to bring in more revenue, this would have been even more profitable for them. He adds, without giving specifics, that he invested a lot of his own money and took on liabilities to increase the future shares of other minority stakeholders, including Robert and Alexander. He ends the interview by saying that his opponents are storytellers and that they are very good at telling their story.
As was this transaction has been me portrayed as, and using the slogans as looting, stealing and criminal acts. Of course. It's you need to understand that they are storytellers and they do that well, and that's what's happening here as well.
Another interview in the video is with writer Argo Tuulik. He was one of the first people to join the Zaum organization and has known Robert since 2001. He was also part of their old group, the Overcoats. Argo says he disagrees with Robert's version of events at the studio. He also confirms that communication was not Robert's strong suit and gives example of situation where this caused problems.
Communication wasn't Robert's strong side. For example, there were moments where the programmers made something. They came to Robert to show it. Robert said, it looks too ugly, I can't look at it. It sort of demoralizes me to a degree where I can't work. And then programmers finished it, came back with it to Robert, and he looked at it and says, no, this is bullshit, what? We can't use this, you need to do it again. And this kind of being short or being inconsiderate with the feelings of others, this was a thing.
On the other hand, he says working with Robert taught him some things, like how to handle criticism, though for other colleagues the experience might have been difficult. At the end, Argo makes a point that regardless of what happens with these business disputes, Robert should still have the chance to do something with the world of Elysium, because he is essentially its creator. But, he adds, that opportunity should also remain with everyone who contributed to the first game. After all, without the people who have been labeled demonic money men, the game could never have been released. It was only thanks to everyone's contribution that something good came out of it. The video also includes other employee interviews, which I won't cover in detail here. In general, though, they paint a picture of Robert behaving in a way that were unhealthy for the workplace, using manipulation and dishonesty. They also confirm that in recent times, Robert, Alexander and Helen were not very involved in the actual work, leaving most of it to their colleagues. And they say Robert tried to obtain the game source code toward the end, when he was allegedly planning to start a new studio. Here are a few quotes from those interviews.
So when we started on Final Cut, it was already a significantly smaller team. And importantly, Robert wasn't around, pretty much at all. He during the Final Cut, I had a couple of brief conversations with him about the quests I was working on. So I was assigned the Moralist quest and the Communist quest, both of which I'm very proud of. But I basically did those on my own. Helen was supposed to be the lead writer on that project, but she didn't do any writing as far as I know, and also wasn't much of a lead.
And especially that year, it often felt that the way they made decisions was really kind of had to do with how they were feeling at the time, or really centered around them and not thinking about how that would affect others.
A few days before Robert was dismissed, he suggested that I could do something for him, which is very much in line with what the management alleges that he did. Unfortunately, I can't go into any detail about what that was, other than to say that if I had kind of pursued that suggestion, I believe that it would have been cause for my immediate dismissal, and perhaps more.
I personally received death threats and harassment on my personal accounts on social media, or personal email and things like that.
So, other accusations against Robert and Alexander about not contributing to the project lately, creating a toxic atmosphere, and trying to take the studio's intellectual property actually fair. The final major part of the People Make Games video was an interview with Robert, Alexander and Helen themselves. It begins with them describing what it was like to work on the first game. They say they were given unrealistic deadlines and were expected to finish the game in a very short time. According to Helen, both Robert and Alexander work from 4 o'clock in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. That is 19 hours a day.
You know that it's not going to be possible to release this really complicated CRPG in 11 months' time. You know it's not possible. You're even saying it's not possible, but you're demanded to do it anyway. So you have an option of either walking off the entire thing and letting this incredible potential that's in there and all of the hard work of everyone on it just go to waste, let everyone down, say I can't do this anymore, it's too difficult, or just say, okay, let's try to do the impossible and then fail at it until you succeed at it, basically.
Then they go over the whole situation with the purchase of the studio's shares. Contradicting Ilmar's account, they say that nobody told them about him buying part of the company. They claim that only discovered it themselves by checking the business registry, that they had no knowledge of any schemes or transactions, and that their lawyers confirmed to them that it was all illegal. They say that as shareholders, they requested various company documents, but, as I understand it, received nothing in return, and were soon fired.
Robert was very shocked. I've never seen... he was very afraid. He was just... We went into a state of shock one day when he fully understood what was happening and what were certain contracts that he had signed and what he had given away, certain rights. I didn't know what to do. I called the NHS services for mental health, and it was 24 hours of just seeing someone in complete state of shock.
We were completely excluded from all of running the company. Any talks between Margus and them, all I can say what my lawyers have told us, both about the legality of these things, and it's highly illegal.
As for the accusations that they tried to steal their IP and sell it to other big game studios, Robert says no one ever provided any evidence or even details about this claim. And finally, they suggest that perhaps some people are trying to shift the focus of this whole story away from the alleged theft of large sums of money and years of work, and toward the idea that Robert is simply an unpleasant person who is hard to work with. Speaking of toxicity inside the studio, Helen was also fired, though personally I don't fully understand the reason. She doesn't seem to have tried to take the studio's IP or to have created a toxic work environment. She describes several situations, including one where a producer, one of the people Robert and Alexander are now in legal dispute with, yelled at her during a conversation, criticized her work and called her lazy.
He just said that people like you are not meant to be leaders. You don't have what it takes to be a leader. I think you should step back. I honestly thought that he was just firing me. That's what it felt like, that the call ended. I remember I took off my headphones and another writer who had stepped into the room asked who had screamed at you, because even through my headphones it was just, you could hear that someone was screaming at me.
So it seems the studio's management wasn't exactly fostering a healthy workplace either. I should also note that, according to Argo Tulik, two of the people interviewed in the documentary who accused Robert of toxicity later took over the positions previously held by Robert and Alexander. So I would take their interviews with a good dose of skepticism. That is more or less where the film wraps up. As I've said, I still believe the People Make Games team did an enormous job in creating it. Now about the legal proceedings. In March 2023, Zaum announced that all legal disputes have been settled due to lack of evidence, though the details remained confidential. Robert and Alexander responded that Zaum's statement was wrong and misleading in several ways. And just recently, in March 2025, an Estonian court ordered Zaum to provide Robert and Alexander with financial documents for their lawsuit. So it seems that not all legal disputes have been resolved after all. If you remember, after the release of the first game, the studio began working on a sequel codenamed Y12, as well as a sci-fi game called P1, led by Kaur Kender. You might be wondering what happened to this project after the main authors left the studio. PC Gamer published an article that shed some light on this. The Y12 sequel was cancelled after Robert, Alexander and Helen left. The P1 sci-fi project was cancelled shortly after Kaur's departure as well. After that, the studio started developing a new project, X7. This game was planned as a spin-off of the original, focusing on one of the Disco Elysium's most beloved characters. The project was led by Argo Tulik, whose interview we talked about earlier. At the end of 2023, there was even an internal presentation of X7. The team was impressed, morale went up, and it seemed like the project had real potential. But just 2 months later, a quarter of studio's employees, including Argo himself, were fired, and the project was cancelled. So, what about a Disco Elysium sequel? As we just discussed, a direct sequel is unlikely. But by the end of 2024, no fewer than 3 different studios, all founded by former Zaum employees, announced they were working on spiritual successors to Disco Elysium. Robert, Alexander and Helen started their own studio, Red Info Studio, and are also working on something new. And on top of all of that, Zaum itself announced a new game, codenamed Project C4. It won't be set in the world of Elysium, but will instead be a spy-themed RPG. Okay, that wraps up part 1 of this story. So, what conclusions can we draw from all this? First, Disco Elysium is a brilliant game. Second, was it stolen from its creators? As far as I understand, the court decided it wasn't. But I can't shake the feeling that there is still something unfair about the way the people who imagined and built the world of Elysium over 15 years ended up leaving the studio. Even Zaum, the name they come up with back in 2009, now has nothing to do with them. The studio carrying that name is run by entirely different people. Still, I'm glad they managed to bring the game into the world, despite the many moments when things could have gone completely wrong. And I hope this isn't the end of the story, that there are still twists ahead that might pleasantly surprise us. In part 2, we will look at the same events, but this time from the perspective of one of the people directly involved. And we will uncover a lot of interesting details about what happened at the studio after Robert, Alexander and Helen left. That's all for now, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.